Hi, welcome back to Criminology. We're going to pick up where we left off. At the end of part 1, we just introduced the radical Marxist theory. So remember, interchangeable, radical theory, Marxist theory. Now we have just finished up on the fundamentals of the radical Marxist theory. So in part 2, we're going to carry on with the Marxist criminology definition of crime, and then we're going to complete all of chapter 8 now in part 2. So let's get beginning here. To a Marxist, crime is a political concept. It's designed to protect the power and position of the upper class at the expense of the poor. To Marxist criminologists, criminals are not social misfits. Instead, they see them as products of a society and its economic system. Now that's quite a departure from some of our other theories. Now according to a couple of criminologists, Lynch and Groves, they laid out 3 implications regarding this view. Now the first implication is each society has its own type and amount of crime. Because each society has a different political system or a different economic system. Secondly, each society has its own distinctive ways of dealing with criminals, whether it's prisons or other means of sanctioning. And then 3, each society gets the amount and type of crime it deserves. Because it's an imbalanced system, that's why it's referenced as deserves, that these guys need to have more balance so they get what they deserve as a society. Essentially, they see criminals not as outsiders. Instead, criminality is a function of social and economic organization. Now, this would mean that the way to manage crime, the way to manage crime is to address the social conditions and that promote the crime. So that could be things like poverty, lack of work opportunities, and things like that. So when we look at the economic components, we should probably touch on the economic structure and what's known as a surplus value. Now there's an image I'm putting beside me that's in your textbook that'll help. So one of the important aspects of the capitalist economic system is the effect of what is known as surplus value. Now surplus value are the profits produced by the laboring class. That's you and I. We work for other people who own those businesses. So the profits produced by us that are then accumulated by the business owner for their own particular business and benefit. Now because more people are displaced, this would mean in the instance if you're working in a factory. I used to work at General Motors when I was in university, and technology started to pick up where some jobs were replacing people with technology. So downsizing and replacing of people being replaced by by technology, these are this is the productive relationship where the rate of surplus value increases. So the more people who aren't working and technology is taking over, or the more downsizing to get the same work done with less, is what's benefiting the economics relationship for those that run it. So it results in more profits. Those displaced workers become increasingly marginalized and powerless, thereby leading to an even greater disparity in this power wielding by the haves over the have-nots. Now, the living conditions of the powerless of the society consequently deteriorate further. Now, we've talked in other chapters around the disorganized city centers or disorganized communities, how they promote more crime, and that's exactly what they're saying here too. So these powerless of society consequently they're deteriorating more further. The crime rates are increasing even faster, and along with greater exercise of power to maintain control over that group of lower class people. Now consider, we just gone through the COVID-19 pandemic, and current recession has made the division of our division of labor, this division between the rich and the poor and the marginalization, much more clear. The gap between the rich and the poor through either job losses, government spending, health issues. Remember, health is wealth. This is what's been witnessed certainly during this period of pandemic time when people were having difficulties maintaining jobs. Well, those who were certainly well off had little trouble maintaining and managing through all of this period. From the radical Marxist theory has emerged a couple of approaches, broad stroke approaches. One is known as instrumental Marxism and the other is structural Marxism. Instrumental Marxism, this sees that the criminal law and the justice systems are really just tools that the powerful use to control the poor and keep them disenfranchised. Basically, instrumentalists see the legal system as a tool or an instrument to be used by the capitalists. That's why it's known as instrumental. Whereas the structural Marxists, they see the capitalism as a self-maintaining system in which the law and the justice system, they work together to perpetuate the existing system of power relationships. So the structuralists see the system as a system that it's there for everybody, so it really just maintains the status quo. Now you'll find in your textbook there will be some examples on those two to give you a bit of an idea. So let's turn some of our attention to what kind of research is being done. So research into the Marxist criminology. Marxist criminologists are less focused on empirical data from research methodology, and they find there's a great deal more interest in the analytical and the historical accounts. Social trends are meaningful to them as they consider the relationship between capitalism and social interaction. And you observe trends over time, and that's why this sort of historical account and analytics is important to them. Marxist critical thinkers analyze the historic development of a capitalist, social controlled institutions such as criminal law, police agencies, courts, and prison systems. Their research also looks at crime, the individual, and the state. Now, in terms of this theory, state really just means government. So their research is focused on crime, the individual, and the role of government. And to this end, the Marxists have two common themes. Crime and its control are a function of capitalism. It's part of what capitalism does, is recognize and identify crime and control it. The justice system, this is the second important point, the justice system is biased against the working class and favors the upper class. If you look in the news, most of what we see as news about crime are news about crime of people who live in the middle class or lower class. We don't see as much news about crime committed by the upper class. The resulting evidence in this research has shown links about the operation of the justice system to class bias. Historical analysis is the area that the Marxists like to use. This is an approach that looks to the past to see if, when, or how commonly held institutional beliefs and practices were established. You can do that over time. If you can look at the historical account over time, you can see how patterns evolved and how institutions got formed, as well as beliefs and traditions. Now, you might be thinking, and I hope you are, that if we were to critique the Marxist theory, the main critique is their lack of research based on scientific methodology and empirical evidence, and that they only really sort of rehash old traditions of standing up for the working class. Other issues are related to the view of the capitalist system. They wonder whether or not there's been enough research into the capitalist system of today, which are more complex. So now we're going to move to what are the emerging, more current theories that we could look at. So the emerging forms of critical criminology. There are several emerging forms of social conflict theory that innovatively incorporate radical theory and Marxist ideas into new ways. In our text, it discusses three of these relative newcomers to social conflict theory. And we're going to start with left realism. Left realists contend that radical criminologists are simply radical idealists and have developed only weak crime control strategies, while the left realists recognize crime as an inevitable outcome of social and political deprivation. So they don't seem to have strong evidence at this point. But according to a researcher, Jock Young, one of the most significant contributors to the left realism, 4 elements must be considered when addressing crime. The first is the victim, the second is the offender, the third is the state or government, but the fourth is the general public. Left realists seek a crime control agenda capable of being implemented in a capitalist system that will protect more vulnerable members of the lower class from crime and the fear of crime. So the focus on left realism is really to focus on these sources, not even the sources, the resulting areas that get most affected by this bias, and trying to support and genuinely find a way to improve those circumstances. Now, one of the things that they reference is what's called preemptive deterrence. Preemptive deterrence, this is an approach to utilize the community organizations and youth involvement in an effort to reduce crime. So they incorporate the use of people in these more disorganized areas to organize and be a part of the solution. The second sort of emerging form is what's known as critical feminism. Now, the feminist movement, just as a bit of a background history, the feminist movement has 3 waves. The first wave started in around about the 1850s, and this is where women were fighting to be seen as a person. The second wave was emerging in the 60s, and along with many other social upheavals during that time, as we alluded to in part 1. And finally, the third wave began in the early 90s. Now, it's in this period of the 60s, 70s that the feminist research turned their attention to criminology theories that had historically ignored women in the criminal system. A big part of their position is the inequity between men and women, because they recognize that the inequity doesn't exist because of biology or psychological differences. Instead, they posit that the differences that we see and experience are socially constructed. Now, that's an important feature in this discussion. A little background, I teach a course as well called Gender Studies, and in that course, it's one of the main tenets that we try to grasp at, is that there are biological differences, of course, between men and women, but those differences don't account for the differences in the way that men and women have been unequally accessing some of the elements of the social world, jobs, equal pay. The differences are instead socially constructed. What it is to be feminine or masculine are taught. They're not biological or genetic. The feminists see this as patriarchy, this socially constructed view of how women should be treated and men should be treated, or how men should behave and women should behave, is based on a belief that the tradition of male-led societies are correct, and that's known as patriarchy. The tradition, it's passed down from generation to generation through family stories, through home experiences, how mom and dad behaved and played roles, through the media, through social media, movies, of the male dominance. This position that males are the breadwinners, they are the leaders, they are the go-tos, and women are really just adjunct to men. It was clearly more that way in the 1850s. However, patriarchy is male dominance, but there's also matriarchy and egalitarian. Matriarchy is female-led families and societies, and we don't see that much in human societies, but we do see it in the elephant kingdom. And egalitarian is more of a balance. We see this is emerging more in families, is more balance between what the roles of men and women are in having a family, more balanced. So the simplest way to view a critical feminist perspective is to consider that with patriarchy, it's about add value to work men do and devalue the view of work that women do. And that's what patriarchy has historically done. And we see in our society a shift away from that, but we're not yet away from that. With capitalism, there is also a division of labor. So in society, it sets the stage for the term what we know as domestic work. This is the work that was traditionally done by women that was unpaid to maintain a home, to have and raise children. In terms of family, these are critical to successful family. However, in a patriarchal perspective, this is not as valued as the work that men do. This patriarchal perspective has certainly been changing. However, the emphasis needs to be on changing. Therefore, you could almost look at that as being evolution rather than changed with the ED at the end, because it hasn't changed. Keeping with the critical feminists, let's see how patriarchy and crime are related for the critical feminist movement. The critical feminist view that patriarchy and the powerlessness experienced by women may actually increase the likelihood that they will be targets for crime. Should men struggle to get or keep work, there's a tendency for men to need to build their self-image up as a result of these negative and bad things. I can't be the breadwinner, so then who am I? And unfortunately, many men choose violence towards their spouse, partner, or even a stranger. Now, part of that is also based in patriarchy. So critical feminists, they also focus on the exploitation of women and criminality. They suggest it makes really no difference which economic system is in place, that it's patriarchy that facilitates the male socialization as many males learn to exploit women. Now, we can't jump to all men all exploit all women, but we can say that within our socialization process, there is still this notion that how we raise boys and how we raise girls are different enough that it explains some of the differences that we see in adulthood and in our society. I mean, just in the last few years, we can consider the Me Too movement as being an element that reminds us that this dynamic of men affecting women in criminal activity does exist and does happen. We don't hear about it as much because it may not be reported, and therefore unreported crime doesn't get counted. Critical feminists also explore how the justice system penalizes women. There is much work done on the exploration of the role of patriarchy in the justice system. They find strong correlation. Now, correlation doesn't mean cause. It means that they occur at the same time. So they find strong correlation to patterns of discrimination. This includes an example of researchers using court files, training school files, government documents, and other publications. In your text, it uses this example. There used to be a review on the female level of delinquency in Ontario from 1940 to 1960. And the researchers found that sexual activity, real or presumed, meaning rumor, was enough to have a girl incarcerated in a training school. Now, these studies are continuing, and of course the results aren't quite as dramatic as they were between 1940 and 1960. All right, let's move into the third kind of grouping of power and control theory as an emerging form. Now, it's related to the feminist perspective of criminology, in that the control theory originally was proposed by a Canadian, John Hagan, in his book called Structural Criminology, which holds that power relationships existing in the wider society are reflected in the domestic settings, in everyday relationships among men and women and children in the context of family life. So basically, they're of the argument that what you see in a family is not unlike what we see generally in society. Therefore, he had two factors that were important to him. One was class position. That was your power. Are you a lower class, middle class, or upper class? And family function. And this is where the control was. So therefore, parents essentially reproduced the power relationship they hold in the workplace and in society, a position of dominance at work with control in the household. Now, in this area of social policy, the feminist thinkers have identified a need for increased control over men's violence towards women and children, and the creation of alternatives for women facing abuse, and the protection of children. Now, feminists have also questioned the role of government and mass media in promoting pornography and prostitution and presenting women as undervalued and controlled. Now, some have called for a replacement of men with women in positions of authority and power, especially within the justice system. Now, we can also move into a subcategory. We call it Peacemaking Movement. Now, the most recently articulated critical thinking perspective, peacemaking, promotes the idea of peace, justice, and equality in society. Peacemaking criminology advocates humanistic, nonviolent, peaceful solutions to crime. Peacemaking criminology also is also called compassionate criminology, and it's a perspective that holds that crime control agencies and the citizens that they should be working together to alleviate social problems and human suffering, thus reducing crime. It includes the notion of service. Excuse me. It suggests that compassion, wisdom, and love are essential for understanding the suffering of which we are all a part, and for practicing criminology of non-violence. Now, there have been other contributions contend that criminal justice system is founded on violence, and it assumes that violence can be overthrown with more violence. The peace model is an approach to crime that focuses on effective ways of developing shared consensus on critical issues that have the potential to seriously affect quality of life. Peacemaking criminology, in particular, has now taken root in Canadian legal system through the usage of its ideas in what's known as restorative justice approaches to criminal sanctions. The increasingly positive response to this approach has cemented its usage and is now considered to be an important element to our criminal justice system. Restorative justice is also called reparative justice, is a perspective that stresses remedies and restoration rather than prison, punishment, and victim neglect. The concept of restorative justice stems from the notion of cooperation and reconciliation rather than retribution and punishment. The traditional adversarial system of justice blames and punishes the offender and assumes the win-loss outcome is the only outcome. Restorative justice approach looks to a win-win outcome by focusing on the process of problem solving, including the reintegration of the offender into the community. Restorative justice practices include, for example, what are known as circle sentencing, conferences in which groups of community members assist justice authorities by participating in discussions about available sentencing options and plans to reintegrate offenders back into the community. Well, that's been a rather large chapter on social conflict theories. And that brings us to the end of part 2. And I hope this helps you make sense of the theories. Next week, we're going to start moving into data-driven content. Week 10 and 11, we're going to be looking at violent crime. Okay, everybody. Bye for now, and we'll see you next week.